The clock on the wall read 10:47 p.m. when David pushed his cleaning cart through the heavy backstage doors. The wheels squeaked softly against the polished floor, a sound he'd gotten so used to that he barely noticed it anymore. Another night. Another empty concert hall. To clean. Another performance he'd listened to from behind the curtains while he waited for the audience to leave. He'd been working at the Riverside Concert Hall for 3 years now. 3 years of mopping floors, wiping down seats, and sweeping stages where famous musicians performed pieces that made his heart ache. But David never complained. This job put food on the table. It kept the lights on in their small apartment. Most importantly, it let him be there when his daughter got home from school. Being a single dad wasn't something David had planned for. Life just happened that way. One day you're making plans for the future, and the next day, everything changes. His wife had passed away when their daughter was only 4 years old. In an instant, David became the only parent, the only provider, the only one who could kiss scraped knees and check homework and remember to pack lunches. So he did what he had to do. He took the custodian job because it offered evening shifts. He could walk his daughter to school in the morning, pick her up in the afternoon, help with homework, make dinner, and tuck her into bed before heading to work. Was it exhausting? Absolutely. Did he wish things were different? Sometimes. But when his 8-year-old daughter wrapped her arms around him and said, "I love you, Daddy," nothing else really mattered. Tonight had been a piano recital. A famous performer from somewhere in Europe. David couldn't quite remember where. The man had played Chopin and Beethoven, and the audience had given him 3 standing ovations. David had heard every note while organizing supplies in the storage room. He always listened to the performances. It was one of the small joys of his job. Now the concert hall was silent, except for the hum of the ventilation system. David liked this time of night. The quiet felt peaceful after hours of applause and conversation. He grabbed his broom and walked onto the stage, his footsteps echoing in the empty space. The stage lights were dimmed but still on, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. In the center of the stage sat the grand piano, its black surface gleaming under the lights. David had cleaned around that piano hundreds of times. He knew every curve of its elegant shape, had wiped dust from its surface more times than he could count, but he never touched the keys. That was a rule he'd made for himself 3 years ago on his first day of work. David began sweeping, starting from the back of the stage and working his way forward. He moved the music stands aside carefully, swept around the chairs where the string section had sat during the first half of the program. His movements were efficient, practiced. He'd done this so many times he could probably do it with his eyes closed. As he swept closer to the piano, he slowed down. He always slowed down near the piano. It was like some magnetic force that made his feet move a little slower, made him take a little longer to sweep that particular section of the stage. David leaned on his broom for a moment and just looked at the instrument. A Steinway grand piano. He knew the model, knew approximately what it cost, knew the sound it made was unlike anything else in the world. The same kind of piano he used to dream about owning someday, back when life looked very different. That felt like a lifetime ago now. Back when he was 19 years old and had just received a letter that changed his life. A scholarship to study music at one of the best schools in the country. He'd played that letter to his parents, his hands shaking with excitement. His mother had cried. His father had hugged him so tight he could barely breathe. David had been good at piano. Really good. He'd started lessons when he was 6, and by the time he was in high school, his teacher said he had something special, not just technical skill, but feeling. The ability to make people cry with a simple melody, to make them feel joy or sadness or hope through nothing but black and white keys. He'd practiced 6 hours a day back then. His fingers had been strong and quick, his mind sharp enough to memorize complex pieces after just a few run-throughs. He'd won competitions, performed at recitals, imagined a future on stages just like this one. Except in those dreams, he was at the piano, not sweeping around it. But then life happened. During his first year of music school, he'd met a woman at a coffee shop near campus. She had a smile that lit up the whole room, and a laugh that made him forget whatever he was worried about. They fell in love fast, the way young people do. Got married maybe too quickly, but it felt right at the time. Then she got sick. Really sick. The kind of sick that requires constant care and expensive treatments, and someone to be there all the time. David had dropped out of school to take care of her. The scholarship disappeared. His dreams of becoming a concert pianist got packed away in a box somewhere in the back of his mind. They'd had a daughter during one of the good periods, when the treatments seemed to be working. Those were happy months, full of hope and plans for the future. But the sickness came back, worse than before. And 2 years later, David found himself alone with a little girl who needed him more than anything in the world. He'd sold his own piano a year after his wife died. They'd needed the money for medical bills that kept coming even after she was gone. Watching strangers carry that piano out of his apartment was one of the hardest days of his life. It felt like he was selling a piece of his soul. Now, standing on this stage with his broom in hand, David let himself remember what it felt like to play. His fingers tingled with the memory of it. The weight of the keys under his hands, the way the sound would vibrate through his whole body, the feeling of losing himself completely in the music. He shook his head and went back to sweeping. No point in dwelling on what used to be. He had a daughter to raise, bills to pay, a life to live. Music was a beautiful dream, but dreams didn't keep the electricity on. Dreams didn't buy school supplies or pay for doctor's visits. Still, as he finished sweeping and moved to the edge of the stage, David cast one more look at the piano. Just one song, he thought. What would it hurt to play just one song? The hall was empty. Nobody would know. He could sit down for 5 minutes and remember what it felt like to be the person he used to be. But no. He'd made himself a promise 3 years ago. He wouldn't torture himself by playing something he couldn't have anymore. It was better to just do his job and go home. David gathered his cleaning supplies and headed to the next section of the hall. Behind him, the piano sat silent on the empty stage, waiting in the dim light, like it was holding its breath for something that might never come. Thursday night started like any other night. David had made spaghetti for dinner, helped his daughter with her math homework, and read her 2 chapters of the book they were working through together. She'd fallen asleep halfway through the 2nd chapter, her small hand still holding onto his arm. He'd tucked her in, kissed her forehead, and left for work, with that familiar mix of exhaustion and love that came with single parenthood. The concert that evening had been particularly beautiful. A young pianist, maybe in her mid-20s, had performed pieces by Chopin. David had listened from the supply closet, his eyes closed, his hands unconsciously moving along with the music as if his fingers were remembering every note. When she played the nocturne in E-flat major, he'd felt something crack open in his chest. That had been one of his pieces. One he'd performed at his senior recital in high school. Now it was past 11, and David had finished cleaning the lobby, the restrooms, and the seating areas. He'd taken his time tonight, moving slower than usual. He told himself it was because he was tired, but deep down he knew the truth. He was putting off going onto that stage, putting off facing that piano again. But eventually, he couldn't delay any longer. He pushed his cart through the backstage entrance and onto the stage itself. The piano was there, as always, sitting in a pool of soft light. The lid was still open from the performance. He could see the strings inside, could almost hear the potential for sound just waiting to be released. David swept the stage mechanically, his mind somewhere else. He thought about his daughter's upcoming birthday next month. She wanted a bike, and he'd been saving up for it. Almost had enough. He thought about the leak in their apartment ceiling that his landlord kept promising to fix but never did. He thought about anything except the piano. But the piano wouldn't be ignored. As David swept closer to it, he felt that pull again, stronger tonight than usual. Maybe it was because of the music he'd heard earlier. Maybe it was because he was just tired enough that his defenses were down. Maybe it was because, somewhere deep inside, he was tired of denying this part of himself. He stopped sweeping and stood there, just looking at the instrument. The concert hall was completely silent. He'd checked every section before coming onto the stage. The building was empty except for him. No one would know. No one would see. Just one song, he thought. The same thought he'd been having for 3 years but had never acted on. Just one song to remember what it felt like. Then he'd go back to his regular life and never think about it again. David leaned his broom against the wall. His heart was beating faster now, like he was about to do something dangerous. In a way, maybe he was. He was about to open a door he'd worked very hard to keep closed. He walked to the piano bench and sat down slowly. The bench was the right height, perfectly positioned. His hands hovered over the keys, not quite touching them yet. They were shaking slightly. From nervousness or excitement, he couldn't tell. Maybe both. Then he took a breath and let his fingers rest on the keys. The ivory was smooth and cool under his calloused hands. Hands that had spent the last 3 years gripping mop handles and pushing brooms now remembered a different kind of work. A gentler kind. A kind that had once brought him so much joy he couldn't imagine life without it. David started to play. Softly at first, almost afraid of the sound. The nocturne, in E-flat major. The same piece he'd heard earlier that evening. The same piece he'd played 1,000 times before. The notes came back to him like old friends. His fingers remembered the patterns, the reaches, the delicate touch needed for the softer passages. It was like speaking a language he hadn't used in years, but had never really forgotten. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of different work and different responsibilities. As he played, something shifted inside him. The exhaustion he'd been carrying all day seemed to lift. The worries about money and leaking ceilings and birthday presents faded into the background. For these few minutes, he wasn't a tired custodian worried about making ends meet. He was just a man playing a piano, lost in the music. He closed his eyes and let himself feel it. Really feel it. The vibration of the strings traveling through the piano and into his body. The way each note bloomed in the empty space of the concert hall. The way the music seemed to come not from the piano but from somewhere deeper, somewhere in his own chest. The nocturne ended, but David didn't stop. He couldn't stop. It was like a dam had broken inside him, and years of held-back music came flooding out. He moved into Rachmaninoff, one of the preludes he'd learned in college. His fingers moved faster now, more confident. The music grew louder, more powerful. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was just playing, just feeling, just being in this moment that he'd denied himself for so long. His hands flew across the keys, hitting every note with precision despite years away from the instrument. It was all still there. Every bit of skill he'd worked so hard to develop, every ounce of passion that had driven him to practice until his fingers ached. Every dream he'd had to pack away when life demanded different things from him. Tears were running down his face now, but he didn't stop to wipe them away. He just kept playing, pouring everything into the music. All the grief he'd never fully processed. All the love he had for his daughter. All the exhaustion of working nights and raising a child alone. All the dreams he'd given up, and the ones he still carried secretly in his heart. It all came out through his fingers and filled the empty concert hall with sound. He played with his eyes closed, completely lost in the moment. He didn't hear the door open at the back of the auditorium. Didn't see the figure standing there in the shadows. Frozen, in surprise. Didn't know that someone had pulled out their phone and started recording. David just played. He played like his life depended on it. Like this might be the only chance he'd ever get to be this version of himself again. The version who could create beauty, with just his hands and a piano. The version who had dreams bigger than just surviving day to day. When he finally played the last note of the prelude, his hands were shaking. He sat there for a moment, breathing hard, feeling like he'd just run a marathon. The silence that followed seemed even deeper than before. His heart was pounding, and more tears were streaming down his face. What had he just done? He'd broken his own rule. He'd let himself remember, let himself feel, let himself want something he couldn't have, and now sitting here in the aftermath, he didn't know whether to feel grateful for these few minutes, or devastated that they had to end. David opened his eyes and stared at the piano keys, preparing himself to stand up and go back to being the person he had to be, the custodian, the single dad, the man who didn't have time for impossible dreams. But then he heard something that made his blood run cold. The sound of footsteps. Someone was walking down the aisle toward the stage. David's head snapped up, his eyes wide with panic. He wasn't alone after all. David's first instinct was to run. His legs tensed, ready to bolt from the piano bench like a kid caught doing something he shouldn't. His face burned with embarrassment. He'd been so sure the building was empty, so certain he was alone. Now, someone had seen him, heard him, caught him pretending to be something he wasn't anymore. The footsteps continued down the aisle, getting closer. David stood up quickly, almost knocking over the bench. He wiped his face with his sleeve, trying to erase any evidence of the tears that had been falling just moments ago. His mind raced with excuses. Should he apologize? Should he explain? Should he just grab his cleaning cart and leave as fast as possible? Then a voice called out from the darkness of the auditorium. A woman's voice. Gentle, but filled with something David couldn't quite identify. Please, don't stop. That was absolutely beautiful. David squinted into the dim lighting, trying to see who was speaking. A figure emerged from the shadows, walking up the steps to the stage. It was Helen Rodriguez, the artistic director of the concert hall. David recognized her immediately. She was the one who hired performers, who planned the seasons, who made all the important decisions about what happened on this stage. He'd seen her dozens of times, always dressed professionally, always moving with purpose, but he'd never actually spoken to her. Miss Rodriguez, I'm so sorry, David started, his voice shaky. I know I shouldn't have been playing. I was just finishing up cleaning, and I thought everyone had left. And I didn't mean to. She held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. As she got closer, David could see her face more clearly. There were tears on her cheeks, too. She was smiling, but it was the kind of smile people have when they're overwhelmed with emotion. How long have you been playing? She asked, ignoring his apology completely. David hesitated. I started lessons when I was 6. But I haven't really played in about 10 years. Classed Ram. 10 years, she repeated, shaking her head in disbelief. You haven't played in 10 years? And you just played like that? She gestured toward the piano, as if the instrument itself could confirm what she'd heard. I used to be better, David said quietly, looking down at his hands. I'm out of practice. Quote, Helen laughed, but it wasn't a mocking laugh. It was the kind of laugh that comes from pure astonishment. Out of practice? That was one of the most moving performances I've heard on this stage in years. And I've heard everyone. Literally everyone. David didn't know what to say to that. He stood there awkwardly, still half expecting to get in trouble, still thinking this couldn't be real. People like him didn't get compliments from people like her. He cleaned the floors. She ran the entire operation. They existed in completely different worlds. What happened? Helen asked, her voice softer now. Why did you stop playing? And there it was. The question David had been avoiding for years. The question he barely let himself think about, let alone answer out loud. But something about this moment, about being caught in his most vulnerable state, made him tell the truth. Life happened, he said simply. I had a scholarship to study music, but my wife got sick, and I had to drop out to take care of her. Then we had a daughter, and then my wife passed away. And suddenly, I was a single dad trying to figure out how to keep everything together. Music, it didn't fit anymore. Helen was quiet for a moment, absorbing this information. "I'm sorry about your wife," she said. "That must have been incredibly difficult." David nodded, not trusting his voice to stay steady if he tried to speak. "But you still have it," Helen continued. "That gift. It didn't go anywhere. It's still right there inside you." Ground. Before David could respond, a movement from the side of the stage caught his attention. Two of the stage hands, Tom and Kevin, were standing in the wings. They must have heard the music too. Tom was holding his phone up, pointed in David's direction. David's stomach dropped. "Were you recording that?" Tom looked guilty but nodded. "Man, I had to. Nobody would believe it otherwise. Our janitor just played like a concert master. That's not something you see every day." Please don't post that anywhere," David said quickly, panic rising in his chest. "I really don't want." "Too late," Kevin interrupted, looking at his own phone. Tom was live streaming on his personal account. "It's already got like 2,000 views." 2,000? David felt dizzy. This couldn't be happening. This was supposed to be a private moment. A secret moment. Just him and the piano and the memories he'd been carrying for all these years. Now strangers on the internet were watching it. Helen pulled out her own phone and started typing. After a moment, she showed David the screen. David stared at the numbers climbing on the screen. 5,000 views. 7,000. 10,000. People were sharing it, commenting on it. The video was spreading across the internet like wildfire. The comments were flooding in faster than David could read them. This made me cry. Who is this guy? That was absolutely incredible. The way he plays with so much emotion. This is what real talent looks like. I've never heard Rachmaninoff played with such feeling. That. Rachmaninoff. I don't understand, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. Why would anyone care about this? Helen looked at him with something like amazement in her eyes. Because people can hear it in your playing. The passion. The heartbreak. The beauty. You're not just playing notes, David. You're telling a story. And it's a story that people connect with. Tom was still watching his phone, his eyes wide. Dude, it's at 50,000 views now. And the local news is sharing it. This is going viral. Viral. The word hung in the air like something from a foreign language. David cleaned concert halls. He packed lunches for his daughter. He worried about paying bills and fixing leaky ceilings. He didn't go viral. That happened to other people. People whose lives were interesting and special. What do I do? David asked, looking at Helen like she might have answers he didn't. She smiled at him. A warm, genuine smile. Well, first, you breathe. Second, you realize that your life just changed. And third, you start thinking about what comes next. What comes next? David repeated. He couldn't think past the next 5 minutes, let alone what came next. Helen's phone rang, and she glanced at the screen. It's Channel 7 News. They want to do a story. She looked back at David. Are you ready for this? Was he ready? David had no idea. An hour ago, he'd been sweeping this stage. Invisible to the world, content to keep his head down, and his dreams buried. Now people were watching him, thousands of people. Maybe more. They'd seen him at his most vulnerable. Heard him pour his heart out through music he thought he'd left behind forever. His phone started buzzing in his pocket. Text messages coming in one after another, probably from people he knew who'd seen the video. His hands were shaking as he pulled it out, but the first message wasn't from a friend. It was from an unknown number. Is this the pianist from the video? We'd like to talk to you about a performance opportunity. Then another message, and another. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. David looked up at Helen, at Tom and Kevin, at the piano that had betrayed his secret to the world. His carefully controlled life was unraveling in real time. And he had no idea if that was a good thing or a disaster waiting to happen. I need to go home, David said suddenly. My daughter. I need to check on her. But even as he said it, he knew nothing would ever be the same again. David barely slept that night. He'd rushed home from the concert hall, his mind spinning with everything that had happened. When he got to the apartment, his daughter was still sound asleep, peaceful and unaware that her father's life had just turned upside down. He'd sat on the edge of her bed for a long time, just watching her breathe, trying to ground himself in what was real and solid and unchanging. But his phone kept buzzing. All night long. Messages, emails, notifications. He'd finally turned it off around 3 in the morning. But sleep never came. He just lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was really happening or if he'd wake up and discover it had all been some strange dream. By morning, he knew it wasn't a dream. When he turned his phone back on, there were over 200 notifications waiting for him. The video had been viewed more than 2 million times. 2 million. He couldn't even comprehend that number. That was more people than lived in some cities. And they'd all watched him play. They'd all seen him cry. They'd all witnessed the most private moment of his life. His daughter found him in the kitchen, staring at his phone with a dazed expression. She was 8 years old, bright and curious, with her mother's smile and David's stubborn determination. "Daddy, why do you look so weird?" she asked, pouring herself a bowl of cereal. David wasn't sure how to explain this. Something happened last night at work. Something unexpected. What kind of something? He showed her the video on his phone. She watched it all the way through, her eyes getting wider and wider. When it ended, she looked up at him with amazement. "Daddy, that's you. You're playing the piano like the people we see on stage." "Yeah, sweetheart. I didn't know you could play like that." There was something almost hurt in her voice, like she'd discovered he'd been keeping a secret from her. David sat down next to her, trying to find the right words. "I used to play a lot, before you were born, before I met your mom. But then life got busy, and I had to focus on other things, more important things, like taking care of you." She was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Why didn't you ever tell me? I guess I thought it didn't matter anymore. That it was just something from my old life. Before everything changed." His daughter looked at him with those serious eyes that sometimes made her seem much older than 8. "But it does matter, Daddy. You look happy when you're playing. I've never seen you look like that before." Her words hit him harder than he expected. Had he really been hiding his happiness from her? Had he been so focused on just getting through each day that he'd forgotten what it felt like to actually enjoy something? Before he could respond, there was a knock at the door. David opened it to find a news crew standing in the hallway. A reporter with perfect hair and a camera operator with equipment balanced on his shoulder. "David Collins?" the reporter asked with a bright smile. "I'm Brad Chen from Channel 7 News. We'd love to talk to you about the video that's taken the internet by storm." David's first instinct was to close the door. But his daughter had followed him and was peeking around his legs, fascinated by the camera. "I don't think this is a good time," David started to say. "Please, just 5 minutes. People want to know your story. The single dad who's been hiding this incredible talent while working as a janitor. It's inspiring. It's exactly the kind of story people need to hear right now." Something about the way he said janitor bothered David. Like it was something to be ashamed of. Like his job wasn't good enough or important enough. But before he could say anything, his daughter tugged on his sleeve. "Can we do it, Daddy? Please? I want to see how the camera works." And that's how David ended up sitting on his worn couch, his daughter next to him, talking to a news reporter about the strangest night of his life. The camera captured everything: the small apartment with its faded furniture, the pictures of his late wife on the walls, his daughter's artwork hung on the refrigerator, all the pieces of their quiet, ordinary life suddenly on display for strangers to see. The reporter asked about his background, about why he'd stopped playing, about what it felt like to have the video go viral. David answered honestly, though it felt strange to talk about such personal things with a camera pointed at his face. "So, what's next for you?" the reporter asked. Are you going to pursue music professionally now? David hadn't even thought that far ahead. I have a job. I have responsibilities. I can't just drop everything and chase a dream. But isn't that exactly what dreams are for? Chasing? The interview ended, and the news crew packed up their equipment and left. David closed the door and leaned against it, exhausted, even though the day had barely started. His phone rang. It was Helen, from the concert hall. David, I hope you're sitting down, she said. I've been getting calls all morning. Everyone wants to talk to you. There's a morning show that wants you to perform live. A classical music magazine wants to do a feature, and that's not even the biggest news. What's the biggest news? David asked, though he wasn't sure he could handle any more surprises. I got a call from the dean of the Harrison School of Music. You know, one of the top music schools in the country. They want to offer you something. David's heart started beating faster. Offer me what? Offer me what? A teaching position. Part-time, so you could still take care of your daughter. They'd also let you complete your degree with a full scholarship. David, they're basically giving you a second chance at the dream you had to give up. The words didn't seem real. David had to ask her to repeat them twice before they actually sank in. A teaching position. A scholarship. The chance to finish what he'd started all those years ago. I don't know what to say, David managed finally. You don't have to decide right now. But David, opportunities like this don't come along every day. You should at least think about it. After he hung up, David sat on the couch in silence. His daughter climbed up next to him, sensing something big was happening, even if she didn't fully understand what. Daddy, are you okay? I don't know, sweetheart. I really don't know. Over the next few hours, more messages came in. A fundraising page that someone had started had raised $15,000 for him to buy a piano. People he'd never met were sending money, saying his story had touched them, saying they wanted to help. A local piano store called to say they wanted to donate an upright piano for his apartment, completely free. Then, there was a message from his old music teacher, the one who'd trained him through high school. I always knew you were special, David. I'm so glad the world is finally seeing it too. Call me when you can. David's daughter went to school that day, and apparently everyone knew about the video. Her friends' parents had seen it. Her teacher had seen it. Kids kept asking her what it was like to have a famous dad. She came home bursting with excitement, talking non-stop about how cool it was that everyone knew who her father was. But David felt overwhelmed. His quiet life had been turned into a public spectacle. His privacy was gone. Strangers felt like they knew him because they'd watched him have a vulnerable moment on video. And now decisions had to be made. Big decisions. Life-changing decisions. That evening, after his daughter was asleep, David sat in the dark living room and let himself think about the offer from the music school. Could he really do it? Could he go back to that world after so many years away? Could he balance teaching and studying and being a single parent? And more importantly, did he even want to? He'd made peace with his life the way it was. He'd accepted that some dreams stay dreams. Opening that door again meant risking everything. Risking failure, risking disappointment, risking his carefully built sense of stability. But it also meant possibility. It meant his daughter could see him doing something he loved. It meant maybe, just maybe, he could have both the life he'd built and the dreams he'd buried. David picked up his phone and stared at Helen's number. One call could change everything. Or he could ignore it all, let the attention fade away, and go back to being invisible. His finger hovered over the screen, and for the first time in 10 years, David let himself wonder, what if? David made the call 3 days later. 3 days of barely sleeping, of weighing every possibility, of making lists of pros and cons that never seemed to help. 3 days of watching his daughter's face light up whenever someone mentioned the video, seeing a pride in her eyes that he'd never seen before. That's what finally made the decision for him. Not the money or the prestige or the chance to reclaim his dreams. It was the way his little girl looked at him differently now. Like she'd discovered her dad was someone special. Helen answered on the first ring, like she'd been waiting for his call. "I was hoping I'd hear from you. I want to do it," David said, his voice steadier than he felt. "The teaching position, the scholarship, all of it. I want to try." There was a pause on the other end, and when Helen spoke again, he could hear the smile in her voice. "I was really hoping you'd say that. When can you start?" The next 2 weeks were a blur. David gave notice at the concert hall, though he felt guilty about it. The job had kept him and his daughter afloat for 3 years. It had been reliable and safe, and leaving it felt like jumping off a cliff without knowing if there was water below. But his boss surprised him. "David, I've watched you clean these floors for years. You've always done good work, and you've never complained. But you weren't supposed to stay here forever. Go do what you're meant to do. We'll be fine. RS." The piano arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. A beautiful, upright, delivered by 2 men, who carefully maneuvered it through the narrow doorway of the apartment. David's daughter rushed home from school and stood staring at it like it was made of magic. She touched the keys gently, almost reverently, and a simple note rang out in their small living room. "Can you teach me?" she asked, looking up at David with hopeful eyes. "Of course I can teach you," he said, pulling her close. "That's what dads are for." That evening, they sat together on the bench, David's hands guiding hers over the keys, showing her the basics. C, D, E, F, G. The simple scale that every beginner learns. She pressed each key with careful concentration. And even though the notes were halting and uncertain, they were the most beautiful sounds David had ever heard. The next week, he started at the Harrison School of Music. Walking through those halls felt surreal, like stepping into a life he'd imagined so long ago that it had become more fiction than memory. Students rushed past with instrument cases, their young faces full of the same passion David had once felt. He wondered if they knew how lucky they were to be here, to have this chance without having to give it up. His first class was small, just 8 students learning advanced piano technique. David stood in front of them, more nervous than he'd been in years. What did he have to teach these talented kids? He'd been away from this world for a decade. His hands were rougher now, his technique probably rusty. What if he'd made a terrible mistake? But then he sat at the piano and began to play, demonstrating a difficult passage from Beethoven. And as his fingers moved across the keys, he felt something click into place. This was right. This was where he was supposed to be. Not instead of being a father, but in addition to it. Both things could be true at the same time. The students watched him with the kind of attention that told David they understood. They weren't just seeing a teacher. They were seeing someone who'd lived through loss and hardship and had somehow found his way back to the music. That meant something. After class, a young woman approached him. She was maybe 19, with nervous energy and a violin case slung over her shoulder. "Mr. Collins? I just wanted to say I watched your video. Like, probably 50 times. And it made me realize something." "What's that?" David asked. "That technique isn't everything. You can play all the right notes perfectly and still miss the whole point. But when you played that night, you weren't just playing notes. You were playing your life. And that's what made it so beautiful." David didn't know what to say to that. He nodded, feeling a lump form in his throat, and the student smiled and walked away. But her words stayed with him for the rest of the day. Helen called that evening with more news. The concert hall wanted David to perform at their community showcase next month. A real performance. On that same stage, where he'd swept floors for 3 years. The same stage where his secret had been revealed to the world. "It'll be a full house," Helen said. "Everyone wants to see the viral pianist perform live. Are you ready for that?" David looked at his daughter, who was practicing her scales at the piano, with fierce determination. "I think so," he said. "Yeah, I think I am. The weeks leading up to the performance were intense. David practiced every spare moment, rebuilding the stamina and precision he'd lost during his years away. His fingers remembered more than he'd expected, but they also had to relearn what time and different work had taken away. Some nights he'd practice until his hands ached, until his daughter would come out of her bedroom in her pajamas and tell him he needed to sleep. "You're already good enough, Daddy," she'd say. "Everyone already loves you." But David wasn't practicing for everyone else. He was practicing for himself, for the young man who'd had to give up his scholarship, for the husband who'd watched his wife slip away, for the single father who'd spent years believing his dreams were dead. He was practicing to prove that it wasn't too late, that second chances were real. The night of the performance arrived. David stood backstage, the same backstage where he'd stored his cleaning supplies for 3 years. But everything felt different now. He was wearing a suit instead of a custodian's uniform. He was about to walk out as a performer instead of the man who cleaned up after the performers left. Helen found him in the wings. "The place is packed. Standing room only. Are you nervous?" "Terrified," David admitted. "Good," she said with a smile. "That means you care." From the audience, David could hear the murmur of voices, the rustle of programs, the coughs and whispers of a crowd waiting for something to begin. Somewhere out there, his daughter was sitting in the front row, wearing her favorite dress, probably bouncing with excitement. He'd gotten her a special seat so she could see everything. The stage manager gave him the signal. It was time. David walked onto the stage, and the applause washed over him like a wave. All those faces looking at him, all those people who'd seen his moment of vulnerability and decided it meant something. He sat at the piano, the same piano he'd played that night, and looked out at the audience. He found his daughter's face in the crowd. She was beaming at him, her small hands clapping as hard as they could. And in that moment, David realized something important. This wasn't about reclaiming his old dreams or proving something to the world. This was about showing his daughter that life could change. That giving up one thing didn't mean giving up everything. That love and sacrifice and responsibility could exist alongside passion and dreams and joy. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play. Not for the audience. Not for the people who'd watched the video. Not even for himself. He played for his daughter, so she could see what it looked like when someone refused to give up on the things that made them whole. The music filled the concert hall, and David felt a peace he hadn't known in years. He'd spent so long thinking he had to choose between being a good father and being a musician. But sitting here now, playing for his daughter, he understood that the two weren't separate at all. They were part of the same story. His story. When the final note faded, the audience erupted. People stood, applauding, some wiping tears from their eyes. But David only looked at his daughter. She was standing too, clapping with everything she had, her face shining with pride. After the performance, she ran backstage and threw her arms around him. "Daddy, that was the best thing I've ever seen in my whole life." David held her tight. This little person who'd been his reason for everything, who'd kept him going through the hardest years, who deserved to see her father happy. "I love you, sweetheart, more than any music in the world." "I love you too, Daddy, and I'm glad you're playing again. You smile more now." That night, driving home with his daughter asleep in the back seat, David thought about the strange journey that had brought him here. One moment of weakness, one decision to play when he thought no one was watching, had changed everything. But maybe it wasn't weakness at all. Maybe it was courage. The courage to admit he still wanted something for himself, even while giving everything to his daughter. The video that had started it all was still being watched, still being shared. Millions of people had seen it now. But David didn't think about them anymore. He thought about the piano waiting in his apartment, the students he'd teach tomorrow, the little girl who now wanted to learn music because she'd seen her father find his way back to it. He'd spent years believing his dreams had died. But dreams don't die. They just wait. And when you're ready, when the time is right, they wake up again. Sometimes they look different than they did before. Sometimes they're better because of everything you've learned along the way. David pulled into the parking lot of their apartment building. Home, with a piano inside now. With possibilities he'd stopped letting himself imagine. With a daughter who'd seen her father prove that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. He carried his sleeping daughter upstairs, tucked her into bed, and sat at the piano in the quiet darkness. His fingers found the keys, and he played softly, so as not to wake her. Just a simple melody, a lullaby, a promise that tomorrow would be even better than today.